what the Iranians are doing is also in a way very shattering to that racial myth, that is inside people's psychology, those mental schemas that we have about which populations decide the fate of the world, which populations do not decide the fate of the world, and even if they seem to change the course of history, well, then it must be allowed by Russia, for example. You know what I mean? So I think there is some there are some mental shifts coming, I think, in the way we perceive human beings around the world.
They get people like Scott Ritter yelling at them about what they should do. That's it. But there's no respect for the culture, for the sacrifice they've made, for the war that they are fighting alone. From a moral perspective, they're very much alone. Even here in Lebanon, it's the same moral perspective as you get in Iran, in Yemen, in Iraq amongst the resistance factions, formerly in Syria, although Syria was different in the sense that it's a state and a very kind of secular state. But that's another actual point that I wanted to make. You mentioned in our last conversation how the Soviet Union backed Saddam Hussein in the war against Iran. In fact, they supplied more weapons than the West in total. They backed off at a certain point.
That must have been someone else.
Oh, well, it was brought up in the conversation. Oh, okay.
Okay.
But the main reason for that, so that's from the Soviet Union. Also, the reason why the Soviet Union backed the creation of the State of Israel. The reason they backed the creation of the State of Israel is that they, in my opinion, it wasn't the cleverest plan on their part, having seen that it was Britain and the Rothschilds that were creating Israel, to think that they could use it as a communist, left-leaning enclave in the Middle East to expand Soviet power. They backed Saddam Hussein against Iran. They did back off at a certain point, and then they came back in and provided even more equipment. I mean, I think it came to about $9.2 billion worth of support of Saddam Hussein. But the greatest fear was the Islamic Revolution. The fact that Islamic Revolution could spread to Afghanistan and Soviet Central Asia. And if you remember, when we go to the Bush-Putin conversations, I think we have talked about this before, where Putin was saying it's not a war against terror, it's a war between Jewish capital and Muslim capital. And at that point, he was also helping Bush, if you like, or agreeing with Bush that Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons, etc. Right?
He was the first who contacted Bush. Putin was the first who contacted Bush, giving him support, offering support to fight in West Asia, to fight so-called terrorism.
Yeah. And in Syria, from my experience, in 2018, for example, Russia was actually lobbying President Assad to get Iran out of Syria. Russia didn't want Iran in Syria. They didn't perceive them as an ally. They perceived them to some degree as a partner. But as I keep saying, they allowed Israel, they stood down and allowed Israel to target their positions and the arms supplies that were coming in across the land routes, right? So, and this is my opinion, Russia inherently has a fear of the Islamic Revolution, of the spread of the Islamic Revolution in this region, because it's inherently opposed to global capitalism. And so it inherently allies itself with Israel and with what are perceived as the moderate Sunni states, just as the CIA wanted to replace President Assad with Sunni business class in Syria because they are perceived as easier to deal with and more likely to enter into debt slavery and financial independence, etc., etc. This is something I've just been thinking about for the last few days. because it becomes very clear, and I'd like to get actually Fiorella's opinion as to, because I know people are going to say, oh, but, in Russia, there's 15% Muslim population. But the
but they're not
policy
running
in
the
Russia,
show.
no. And the policy in Russia is inherently perceived as Christian conservative values. And that's very much what they relied upon in Syria, actually, to get a really strong foothold in certain regions in Syria, was this Christian narrative, particularly Orthodox Christian narrative. So I think that takes it almost into another dimension, but it's something that I think is very important for people to understand, because what Iran represents is actually the inverse of global capitalism. It's usury-free banking, it's free healthcare, independent banking, nationalization of all of their resources, for example, free education, the empowerment of women, etc., etc., etc. It's the absolute anathema to what the West and Israel, the Gulf states, and I think Russia are actually working towards.
And it's the same as when people say, "Oh, but Israel has a lot of black and brown Arab Jews and etc. etc." And then I'm like, "Yeah, but they're not running the show. The elite political class are all white Ashkenazi Jews." And it's the same in Russia. You can say they're 50% Muslims. Yeah, but who's running the show? All white Russians. So there is this also in Russia. There is still this European white Christianity kind of white supremacy aspect that we are never allowed to discuss. But that's I'm definitely sure that is going on as well. Otherwise, the ruling class would not mostly be white Russians, And I think there is also that kind of fear, and that's why I think, as not a specialist like you guys, and especially you who live there, Fiorella, but I think that there is still that also that longing to be part of white empire among Putin. That kind of idea that he is a European and that kind of wish to be part of that Western kind of bloc. What do you think?
I would say that is regional, definitely from Putin, definitely from Moscow overall, overwhelmingly. Capitals tend to be that way, to be more westernized in pretty much every country, but it's specifically true in Russia because of just proximity as well. St. Petersburg, even more so. St. Petersburg pretty much mirrors any European city you've been to. And Moscow is extremely now is attempting to bring back the Orthodox Christianity reminiscent of not the Soviet Union, but reminiscent of the Tsar and the Russian Empire. And that is true. There is like a push to go towards that more conservative, ultra religious, ultra, just a traditional thing. They've been talking about traditional values, and this is the perspective from
and
the
racialized, Fiorella, racialized, is that also something that,
Yes.
that you see, like the whiteness aspect of the Europeans?
Well, if you look at Kirill Dmitriev, for example, he aligns himself with a lot of the ultra white nationalists in all over the UK and in Australia. And he has this perspective that I've seen be quite vocal online against immigrants and against that European worry of the immigrant issue happening in Europe, which is obviously a concern in terms of the population aspect, in terms of all of that. But they never talk about the nuances as to why the immigrants are coming in, the various types of immigrants coming in. It becomes a very anti-immigrant prejudice type of position. And that is being largely supported by people like Kirill Dmitriev and people who are very much talking about the control of immigration. Now, in Russia, you have a lot of Muslims, as you mentioned, and they have a lot of people are allowed to worship however they please. The idea of having the Muslim religion or of having Islam around is a normal idea among the population. But as you mentioned, they are not the ones in power. And further, the immigration issue. When you talk about Russia, the Russian Federation, it is massive. When most people think about Russia, they think about Moscow. The further east you get, more towards what used to be parts of the Soviet Union, the Central Asian aspects, you have um, basically a huge population of Muslim people. Then you have the relationship with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan that also has a lot of the Muslim populations that have been used and weaponized by Ukraine for being the ones that set up these terrorist attacks in Russia. And so that's created this idea that pretty much gives them the onus to look at these populations as being the ones that are the problematic ones. So if you're out on the street, let's say in Moscow, and you look like you're Uzbeki or you're Tajik, there is kind of this more of like a sentiment of, oh, like, let's stop them. The officials will stop them and ask them for their papers, ask them for their, their the paperwork that they have. They're pretty much the second class citizens. They're doing the snow plowing, they're doing the working lower labor type of jobs that regular Russians from Russia, born in Russia, are not doing. Now, there are different aspects to that. I'm not saying that everybody is racist or anything like that. I think mostly what you see in the United States doesn't happen in Russia. But I will say there is a sentiment of just kind of uncertainty as related to this idea that Putin, as Vanessa mentioned, has always talked about, opposing terrorism, opposing fighting terrorism. And he says this in a lot of his speeches. If you listen to his speeches, we always stand against terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. So this idea of Muslims being terrorists is still there, but it's not, discussed openly in the way that I think it should be discussed. And it's coming more so from the state, and that sort of, oh, these people are coming in now and they're given all these opportunities because Russia needs the labor. Russia needs more people in Russia. This is why they've been incentivizing people to go, because there's so much land and not enough people. They also need to decentralize their economy from Moscow and move it into the central part of Russia and the Far East, which is why you have the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the Eastern Economic Forum. It's that push to get people into these unpopulated areas of Russia. But this idea that Russia is this, perfect coexisting uh, area is just not true. And the push that we're seeing, for example, to go back to traditional values, to go back to Orthodox Christianity, is it's the government perspective. When you look at the younger populations, they're not religious. They're not, they tend to be more liberal. And so Russia's in a dangerous position right now. And this is something that I don't think is discussed. You have a growing um, sentiment of just from the youth of not relating to either the nostalgia felt by the older and increasingly, less populated aspects of the Soviet Union, where things were better from their perspective under in the Soviet Union. People had healthcare, they had education fully, they had the job workforce, they were paid more, and all of this stuff. So you have that perspective, and then you have the youth that's looking at the special military operation, that's looking at what's going on. Especially the ones in Moscow feel more European, and they kind of are like, why aren't we done with this war right now? And then you have the rest of Russia, which is completely different priorities than Moscow. They're less, capitalist, or more focused on getting a stable economy. They feel completely different in terms of that aspect. And there is this push of, yes, we're all Russians, but there's different ethnicities and different desires and needs. And Russia is in danger because they're so varied, that this is the opportunity that the West will continuously use to balkanize them, which is why you don't make any sort of deal with the United States. But as you mentioned, Putin always wanted to be a part of Europe, right? And in spite of all the attacks against Europe, it's almost like there's an attempt to replace Europe with Russia. And that's what it seems to be. Make Russia the new European superpower. Uh, and that's a whole other, I think, discussion.
And that also explains, I would say, a lot of these more conservative types in among Western independent media commentators. Their love for Russia. There is this undercurrent of there are also these conservative white Christian society, or at least that's in their perception. I mean, Russia is very big. And there, like I said, there is this kind of undercurrent of maybe even unwitting racism, where people have that affinity with Russia and project that kind of heroism on white Christian Russia, while at the same time diminishing the immense contribution of Iran and how Iran is actually really showing some moral leadership besides its very strong stance against the U.S. empire. And I think that is something that we really, we should really consider that and respect that and think about what's going on here. I think it's earth shattering. How can you say that? Like what the Iranians are doing is also in a way very shattering to that racial myth that is inside people's psychology, those mental schemas that we have about which populations decide the fate of the world, which populations do not decide the fate of the world, and even if they seem to change the course of history, well, then it must be allowed by Russia, for example. You know what I mean? So I think there is some there are some mental shifts coming, I think, in the way we perceive human beings around the world, and I think we have to thank Iran for that. Of course, also the Arab resistance in the region. Don't get me wrong, but what Iran is doing right now, of course, is extremely impactful, and I think there is a sense of, among a lot of these commentators, a sense of almost, I would say, an unconscious inability to accept what is going on here, to accept that kind of strength of a country like Iran. I see you want to comment, Vanessa.
Well, I think also to somehow maybe justify that also is that the Zionists have, since, they were established in Palestine in 1948, but even before, as we talked about before, they've been eradicating the history. I mean, under Trump's first administration, Netanyahu shut down the Nakba Museum, right? So basically sanctioning anyone from looking at the documents and the photographs and so on. And there has been an entire campaign to demonize Muslims as a collective group by the entire kind of Zionist cartel of media, Hollywood. We talked about this, video games and so on. Any kind of media complex is being used to effectively lump all Muslims together, number one. They're all terrorists. They're all extremists, fanatics, and so on. And that has effectively been the dominant narrative since 9/11. So I kind of do understand that for an ordinary person, it's very difficult to break out of that paradigm and actually look at a country like Iran, where, again, the propaganda narratives have been overwhelming, and actually look at it as a moral beacon in the world today, as a system of governance, as a philosophy, as an ideology. But if anyone looks deeper into Shia Islam, you will see that at its core ideology is the protection of the oppressed as number one. Not expansion, not economic gain, not global capitalist benefits from the world, but the actual protection and defense of the oppressed, wherever they are in the world, right? It's very important, because that moral center, in my opinion, doesn't exist anywhere outside the resistance axis. And by that, I also include countries not within the Islamic sphere, let's say, even like Venezuela, Cuba, and so on, countries in Africa now that are coming to the fore, like Burkina Faso, who are genuinely working towards governance that benefits the people, the population, rather than the ruling elite or the oligarchies. And so I think it's going to take a lot of time for people to overcome that grating, as you describe it, and get into the understanding of what these resistance countries, these free countries, actually represent, which is this kind of moral leadership that we're all looking for. I'm not saying they're not flawed. I'm not saying but ultimately, what is driving them is a moral cause, right? They've had enough. Like, Iran has been targeted. They know that ultimately they are to be destroyed for Israel and the US to survive as the supremacist, elitist, racist entity that it is, Epstein entity that it is. So, this is actually a war that is being fought by Iran and the resistance axis here in this region, as I've said before, to prevent the world just becoming really an Epstein ruling class with very little challenge or conflict against that. Because ultimately, if that happens, I think China will find a way to work around the issues and to build its economic dominance in certain areas. Will be driven into the kind of spheres of influence, the technate, right, vision, in my opinion. And so I don't really blame people for having that. I do kind of criticize people when, as you say, they are so invested in this image of Russia as some kind of particularly Orthodox Christian traditional values, doesn't entertain terrorism of any sort, but they're happy to invite the head of Al-Qaeda, formerly ISIS, to the Kremlin, not once, twice, right? So I just think, again, actually, you've hit on something which I think, because a lot of the commentators that are, let's say, pushing back against the incoming tech surveillance and kind of part of the all governments are in on it, are very often also holding Christian values. And I wonder if that puts a barrier between them understanding that not all governments are necessarily in on it. Right. That's just a thought I'm throwing out there for people. But I've been watching a lot of these very good analysts, very good commentators, historically brilliant, like their grasp of history and so on is fantastic. And I love watching them. But when it comes down to them having a blind spot as far as the Islamic Revolution and the Iranian constitution, the concept of Iranian governance, it's very clear to me. It's very sort of obvious.
Yeah, we've been heavily conditioned, of course, as Westerners against the Muslim world and Muslims and people from West Asia, whether from Iran or the Arab world. It has been a decades-long systematic psychological bombardment of racism towards people from West Asia, from Hollywood to our news programs to books to it's absolutely insane what the kind of garbage that our brains had to deal with when it comes to these people, and we are now undoing it slowly. And there's, in my opinion, one generation is already lost, and that's the boomers, and also not everyone. My parents were very anti-racist, so in that sense, it's not always the case, but. what I'm saying in general, you have that kind of generation. You see them in the news programs. You still see them in the how do you say that, these intellectual conversation programs, like in my country, the Netherlands. And it's like you hear the shit they say about Muslims and Arabs, and I'm just thinking, forget it. These people's brains are so the racism is so deeply nested in those brains. You can't change it anymore. It's literally physical. You can't change those brains anymore. But you do see a change in the new generation that are very pro-Palestine often. They're supportive of Iran. Their brains have been shaped in a different way. So I do see change. But my goodness, have we been... I come from the 80s. And I grew up with movies, you know, Rambo was always shooting Arabs dead. That was so normal in those days. Like every bad guy was an Arab, and they just shot them, and they were, and I'm like, the crap we had to deal with, and now it has. Now you see how beneficial that has been to global imperialism, and I think that what we're seeing right now is a breakage also of that kind of psychological chokehold that the United States and the West had on our sentiments towards West Asia. And I think Iran and the resistance in general are doing a very good job of really deconstructing that crap that the West has done to us. I think that's an evil that has been done to our brains. You know, we didn't choose this. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Any final comments, Fiorella, Vanessa?
No. Well, I'll just say that I think, it's funny. A lot of the people looking for this revolutionary idea, this sort of socialist, revolutionary, heroic reality, it exists in Iran. They just don't really see it for what it is. If anybody is that idea that they have, it is Iran. It is a resistance in general. The resistance, what it represents, it's a collective approach. It is an approach that looks on at humanity as equal, that is looking towards something better, something that is actually more rooted in an ideal that is altruistic and moral beyond the material pragmatism that exists in this world today. And so if you understand that is what Iran and the resistance are doing, then it is that ideal that a lot of these people seek, when they look at films, for example, that have painted this revolutionary spirit as the heroes, which is ironic, especially coming from the United States and the West. Example, Star Wars. Example, any story where you have the underdog fighting the empire or fighting the evil. It's very easy for them to recognize it in a movie. But when it's happening in the reality of this world, when it's
because
happening
they're
right
white,
now,
huh?
well, yeah,
I was
that
just
too.
gonna say.
That too. They can't see it before them. These are the people you should be rooting for. This is the right side. And in a side like this, in a situation like this, there is a good and a bad. There is like the right thing to do. There isn't just like, oh, well, we need to show both sides. It's like, yeah, but what's morally just and what isn't, and what's happening against Iran and the resistance and the people of West Asia is just morally corrupt. It is inhumane. It is so wrong. It is so easy to see that if it was laid out in a fictional Hollywood made movie. But just pretend it is for a minute of this movie, if that helps these people. The reality is these are people's lives, and these are very real things happening right now, and we have to understand that this is a turning point, I think, for humanity. We've kind of hit a lot of these points, and it's very clear that Iran is fighting evil, and I think we've all said it, all three of us at one point or another, that Iran is fighting the evil on behalf, I think, of humanity, and all of the things that people look for in heroes. Well, that's what's going on right now from Iran and the entire resistance that are risking their lives, and that's it. And that it's as simple as that. I think people need to understand that.
Yeah, and I just want to very quickly add because I know we always get accused of blackpilling people. But I think another important aspect of the resistance that people need to understand, and it was an example that was set to me again or reinforced to me yesterday, was that Israel in the south of Lebanon, just as it's done in Gaza, destroyed an entire town. It literally detonated an entire town. And there were people on X kind of saying, oh my God, it's eradicated, it's erased. And someone from the region actually responded. She said, please don't talk like this. We don't see it this way. We just see it. We can rebuild it better. And I think that was something that really kind of hit me. Although I know it, I've lived in this region for years now, on and off. I mean, working and living in Syria and now living here in Lebanon. This is the attitude. This is the long war we're fighting, and we're prepared to sacrifice everything for this in order to be able to rebuild in freedom and with agency and with recognition of our rights and so on. And so I think that's a very powerful, because in the West, we'd be horrified. It's like, I don't know, if half of London was suddenly just detonated, I don't know if people would recover from that. But here, they see it just literally as part of the process towards the victory against evil. And that's something that I find very uplifting, actually, and very kind of strengthening even for myself. Is that, of course, there's going to be huge loss. There has to be, because you're fighting against an empire. You're fighting against an empire that is degraded to a level of evil and inhumanity that they're unrecognizable as human beings. Right? Even the statements that they're putting out now on social media are getting smashed. I mean, they're just not getting away with any of the propaganda and distortion of truth that they used to get away with even 10 years ago. They're not getting away with it anymore. People are fed up.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that those are very, very, how do you say it, optimistic words. We just rebuild it better. I mean, I love it. And to get back to that heroism that you said, Fiorella, just as I said right now, when I was born in the 80s and I grew up as a little kid seeing all these Rambo movies of shooting Arabs and that kind of stuff, and which was completely normal in those days. It's unbelievable. And the reverse is, of course, also true. We have not only been conditioned to see people from West Asia that way, we've also been conditioned to see heroism as Western white individuals. So even today, when people see what's happening in Iran or in West Asia in general with the resistance, people still cannot connect psychological to that kind of resistance against the bad guys, you could say, because that kind of heroism is in their psychology. They cannot apply that kind of heroism that you see in movies of resistance movies and Second World War movies. They cannot apply that to Arabs or to people in Persia, Iranians. It's like there is this disconnect, that inability to identify with these people. And that's why I always say also in my classes, race and racism is so central to geopolitics. And I'm not talking about intentional racism, people who say like, oh, I hate blacks or something. I'm talking about the cultural, unwitting, unconscious racism that is socialized into us by our cultures, by our social context, that influences the way how we now deal with, for example, the Palestinian resistance, Iran, Russia, etc., etc. And it's just so amazing that all these people always, even in Europe, all these people that celebrated Ukrainian resistance, we're talking about Nazis, and they could still identify more with Ukrainians than with what the Palestinian resistance is doing, or Iran. And there's just such a, like I said, there is this deep psychological effect of racialization that we are often very unaware of. You know what I mean? And like I said, I do see a change, don't get me wrong. I see a lot of very, very positive developments also among Westerners. You see a lot of support for Iran. You see a lot of support for the resistance. But like I said, that's also very much a generational thing. It's the new generation that seems to be really breaking with that stuff much more than when you see, for example, the older generation, like for example my parents' generation and even my own generation, who came from that 80s B movies, anti-Arab movie period. Yeah, I guess let's forget about my part for now and stick to Vanessa's last words about we just rebuild it better, so we can end on a more optimistic note like last time. You've been very generous with your time, both of you, Fiorella and Vanessa. Always great to talk to you. We'll probably soon do it again. And let's talk soon and keep up the good fight.
Thanks, Karim.
Thank you.
Thanks for always having us on.
Static crackles, voices rise. Truth breaks through their velvet lies. A screen of fire, a shield of steel. BettBeat media makes you feel. No borders, no change. No silence.